Welcome back to the Midwest Minute. I'm your host, Ross Thompson, and today I want to do something different from the usual political breakdown. I want to spend real time on a piece of writing that I think is genuinely the high watermark of English language fiction in the 20th century, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And I don't just mean it's a good story, though it is. I mean, I want to actually make the case for why the craftsmanship behind it is different in kind, not just degree, from almost everything that came after it and tried to copy it. We're going to go through the four things today. First, the actual writing craft, why this book works on a sentence level and a structural level in ways most fantasy never attempts. Second, the Christian undertones running underneath the whole story, which Tolkien himself talked about openly. Third, the sheer depth of history behind Middle-earth, which took him something like 60 years to build. And fourth, the quotes from this trilogy that are still genuinely useful to you in your actual life today, not just some nerd trivia. But before we start, I want to give you a chance to like, subscribe, share, follow for more content like this. I have a website, midwestminute.net. Check that out for blogs as well as my other videos, YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, and I think Apple Podcasts. Also follow my X and Facebook, Midwest Minute. Share post there if you feel necessary. But with that, let's begin. So we're going to start with the man himself, because you can't understand any of this without knowing where he came from. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien lost his father at age 3 and his mother at age 12. After his mother died, he was raised by a Catholic priest, Father Francis Morgan, who became the single most important influence on his faith for the rest of his life. That matters, because it means Tolkien's Catholicism wasn't some background detail of his biography. It was the thing that held his whole world together after he lost both parents as a child. Then came World War I. Tolkien fought at the Battle of the Somme, one of the most bloodiest battles in human history, and by the end of the war, of his 4 closest childhood friends, the group he called the TCBS, only he and one other were still alive. He watched almost everyone he loved from his youth get killed in trenches. If you've ever wondered why The Lord of the Rings takes something as small as unglamorous as walking, marching, exhaustion, and the loss of an entire generation of young men so seriously, that's why. Tolkien wasn't writing about war from a distance. He was writing about something he survived when most of the people around him didn't. He became a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, meaning his actual day job was studying Old English and Norse literature, things like Beowulf and the Icelandic sagas, for a living. Everything about Middle-earth grows out of that scholarly life. He wasn't a novelist who dabbled in linguistics. He was a linguist who happened to also write one of the greatest novels of the century. Here's the thing that separates Tolkien from basically every fantasy writer who came after him. He didn't invent a world to hold a plot. He invented languages first, and then built a world so those languages would have somewhere to live. Tolkien created Quenya and Sindarin, 2 complete Elvish languages, each with their own grammar, vocabulary, and history of how they change over time, years before he had a story to even put them in. Quenya was modeled partly on Finnish and Latin. Sindarin drew from Welsh. He was doing this as a young man purely because he loved language. For its own sake, and Middle-earth grew out of this need for a place where these invented languages could plausibly be spoken by someone. Think about how backwards that is compared to how almost every other fantasy series gets built. Most fantasy authors build a plot and then slap some invented words on top for flavor. Not Tolkien. Tolkien built the words first, and the entire mythology grew out of them like a root system. That's also why the prose itself does something unusual. It shifts register constantly and on purpose. When the hobbits are talking, the language is warm, plain, almost cozy, English, full of small talk about meals and gardens. When you're in Rohan or Gondor, the language shifts into something higher and older, closer to the cadence of Anglo-Saxon poetry or the King James Bible. Listen to how Theoden speaks versus how Sam speaks. They don't sound like they're from the same book, and that's deliberate. Tolkien is using register, the way a composer uses keys changes, to signal that you've moved into a completely different emotional and cultural space without him having to say so directly. There's also real structure, sophistication most readers don't consciously notice. The whole trilogy is framed as if it's a translation of an ancient manuscript. The Red Book of Westmarch, supposedly written by Bilbo and Frodo themselves and passed down through Hobbit history, the appendices at the back of the Return of the King aren't an afterthought. They're genealogues, calendars, alphabets, pieces of a found historical document. Tolkien wanted you to feel like you were reading real history that had been translated and edited for you, not a story someone made up. That illusion of found history is a part of why the book still feels different from things that copied its surface without copying that underlying discipline. And then there's the theme underneath everything, which is generally more sophisticated than good guys beat bad guys. The ring itself isn't a weapon, it's temptation, corruption, and power that anyone could use for supposedly good ends and still be destroyed. By even Gandalf, even Gladriel explicitly refuse to touch it because they know themselves well enough to know they'd become tyrants trying to do good with it. That's a much harder and more honest idea than most fantasy bothers with. That good intentions plus enough power still corrupts you. And the actual heroism in the story doesn't come from the power characters at all. It comes from two hobbits who barely matter in the world's politics, walking somewhere on foot because no one else could be trusted not to use the ring themselves. There's also something worth dwelling on in the poetry itself. Tolkien filled the trilogy with dozens of actual songs and poems in different verses forms, different meters, different voices depending on who's singing. The Hobbit's walking songs are light and rhyming. The songs of Rohan are alliterative verses, the exact form used in real old English poetry, like Beowulf, because Tolkien wanted Rohan to feel like an Anglo-Saxon warrior culture dropped into Middle-earth. Almost no other novelist would bother writing dozens of technically distinct poems in different historical verse traditions just to make a fictional culture feel authentic. That's the kind of unnecessary, obsessive craftsmanship that separates Tolkien from someone just telling a fun story. And then there's a theme running underneath all of it that Tolkien himself called the long defeat. Through the mouth of Gladriel, the book states plainly that even the good side in his story is fighting a losing, exhausting battle across the ages, that every victory is temporary, and that ultimately even the beautiful things, the elves, their realms, their magic, are fading out of the world no matter what happens with the ring. That's a much more mature and melancholy idea than good triumphs and everyone lives happily ever after. Tolkien lets his heroes win the specific battle in front of them while being honest that they're still slowly losing the larger war against time, decay, and loss. That honesty is part of why the ending of the trilogy is bittersweet instead of purely triumphant. Frodo saves the Shire, but can never really live in it the same way again, and he ultimately has to leave Middle-earth entirely because his wounds, physical and otherwise, never fully heal. Related to that, there's a real environment and anti-industrial theme that gets less attention than it deserves. Saruman, once one of the wisest of the wizards, falls specifically because he becomes obsessed with machinery, with breeding orcs like weapons, with tearing down forests to fuel his war machine at Isengard. The Ents, ancient tree shepherds, who are almost unbelievably slow to anger, finally rise up and physically tear down Isengard's machinery once Saruman's destruction of the forest becomes too much to ignore. And at the very end of the story, when the hobbits finally return home, they find the Shire itself has been industrialized and polluted in their absence. In a section called The Scouring of the Shire, that a lot of the film adaptations cut entirely, Tolkien lived through the early 20th century's rapid industrialization and 2 world wars built on machinery and the mass production. And you can feel his genuine unease with that entire direction of civilization running through the whole trilogy, not as a lecture, but as a recurring image of what happens and when power gets mechanized and nature gets treated as resource instead of something sacred. Now, here's where I want to spend real time because this is a part of people either overstate or completely miss. Tolkien said this directly in his own letters, not something scholars projected onto him after the fact. He wrote that Lord of the Rings is, quote, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously so in the revision. That is Tolkien's own words about his book. But here's a crucial distinction. This is not allegory. His friend C.S. Lewis wrote Narnia as fairly direct allegory. Aslan stands in for Christ in a pretty one-to-one way. Tolkien actually disliked allegory as a technique and said so explicitly. He preferred what he called applicability, meaning the reader is free to find resonance rather than being told exactly what everything stands for. So there's no single character in The Lord of the Rings who is simply Jesus in a costume. Instead, the Christian shape of the story is built into its bones, spread across multiple characters and moments. Let's go through the specific places you can see it. First, there's a concept. Tolkien himself invented a word for eucastrophe. I knew I was going to get that one bad. It means a sudden joyous turn in a story, right at the moment when all hope seems completely lost. The good news arriving out of nowhere. Tolkien explicitly linked this to the resurrection, calling the resurrection the greatest eucatrophe possible in real history. And Lord of the Rings is built around exactly this structure, most obviously at Mount Doom. Frodo actually fails right at the end. After carrying the ring across the entire world, he puts it on and claims it for himself instead of destroying it. The quest fails by Frodo's own choice in the final moment. And the story is only saved because Gollum, driven by his own corrupt desire, bites the ring off Frodo's finger and falls into the fire with it purely by accident, purely by his own greed turning against him. The world isn't saved by Frodo's strength or virtue in the end. It's saved by something outside of him arriving right when hope was gone. Which brings us to the theme of mercy and providence. Go back earlier in the story to when Bilbo has Gollum at his mercy in The Hobbit and chooses not to kill him out of pity. Gandalf later tells Frodo directly that this pity may end up ruling the fate of many, including Frodo's own fate. That line turns out to be exactly true. If Bilbo and later Frodo had killed Gollum when they had the chance, there would have been no one left alive to accidentally destroy the ring at the very end. Mercy shown to someone who seems irredeemably turns out to be the thing that saves the world. That's about as Christian an idea as you can build a plot mechanism out of. That grace and mercy, which look weak and foolish in the moment, are actually what saves everyone, while cold calculation and force would have doomed the whole quest. Then there's Gandalf. He dies fighting the Balrog in the mines of Moria, a demonic creature from the earliest days of the world. And by every account in the story, he genuinely dies. And he comes back. Gandalf the Grey returns as Gandalf the White, more powerful, transformed, sent back to finish his task. He even says he was sent back until his task was done. That is about as direct an echo of death and resurrection as you can write into a story without literally naming it as such. Now you can look at Aragorn too. He's the hidden rightful king, living in exile and obscurity for decades, knowing to almost no one, who eventually returns to reclaim his throne, and how he is recognized as the true king when he finally arrives, not through a crown or a coronation first. He is recognized because he has the power to heal the sick and wounded in the houses of healing. And there's an old saying, repeated in the book, that the hands of the kings are the hands of a healer. His kingship is proven through healing, through service to the suffering, before it's proven through any political ceremony. That's a strikingly biblical image of what legitimate authority is supposed to look like. Now consider Galadriel's temptation scene, one of the most explicitly moral moments in the whole trilogy. Frodo offers her the ring. She has a moment where she imagines herself as a dark queen, powerful and terrible, and worshipped. And then she consciously refuses it, saying she will diminish and remain herself rather than seize that power. That's a temptation scene in the most literal sense, power offered, imagined, and deliberately refused out of humility, which is the exact inverse of what happens with almost every other character who touches the ring and fails the same test. And then there's Sam, who I think is actually the most quietly Christian character in the whole book. Sam, he's not a king, he's not a wizard or a warrior, he's a gardener. His entire arc is loyalty, humble service, and carrying his master's burden, even when it isn't his own fight. Up to and including literally carrying Frodo up the slopes of Mount Doom, when Frodo can't walk anymore. There's a reason so many readers over the decades have said Sam, not Frodo, is the real hero of the story. He embodies servant leadership in a way that echoes the idea of the last being first, and the greatest among you being the servant of all. Even small details carry this weight. Lambess, the elvish waybread the Fellowship carries, sustains them far beyond what ordinary food should be able to do. And at one point, the text says if it feeds the will as much as the body. Food that nourishes the will and the spirit, not just physical hunger. Carried on a journey through darkness is very hard to read without thinking of the Eucharist. And finally, there's the whole theme of mortality itself, which runs through the entire legendarium, not just the trilogy. In Tolkien's mythology, death is called the gift of men, given by Uru, the creator god, specifically to humans, while the elves live forever within the world and grow weary of it over the ages. Tolkien is working through something genuinely theological here, that death, which looks like a curse, might actually be a mercy, a release, rather than simply the worst thing that can happen to you. That's a very specific and very Christian way of thinking about mortality, one that doesn't treat death as pure tragedy the way most fantasies do. There's one more contrast worth pulling out here, because I think it's the clearest moral argument in the entire trilogy. The difference between Denethor and Theoden. Both men are rulers facing the same overwhelming darkness. Denethor, the steward of Gondor, responds to despair by giving into it entirely. He looks into a seeing stone, sees only defeat, concludes that all hope is already lost, and takes his own life rather than keep fighting, nearly killing his own son in the process. Theoden, king of Rohan, faces the exact same odds, arguably worse ones, and chooses to ride out to battle anyways, not because he's certain of victory, but because giving up is not something he's willing to do while he still draws breath. Tolkien is drawing a direct moral line here between despair, which he treats as a kind of a sin, a failure of faith in something larger than your own immediate circumstances, and hope, which he treats as a virtue you choose to practice even when the evidence in front of you says it's pointless. Gandalf has a line about exactly this, telling Denethor that even a wizard cannot see or plan every possible outcome, so despair is never actually rational. It's just giving up on the things you can't see yet. And there's a broader idea about evil undoing itself that runs through the whole story, one that lines up with the very old Christian and philosophical idea that evil is ultimately self-defeating because it can't create anything, only twist and corrupt what already exists. Gandalf says at one point that the very wickedness and greed of Sauron's own allies will end up working against him. That evil, left alone long enough, tends to turn on itself. And that's exactly what happens at Mount Doom. It's not the free people's strength that finally destroys the ring. It's Gollum's own corruption, greed, biting the ring away from Frodo that finishes the job Sauron's side could never have wanted. The book seems to be arguing that evil, given enough rope, will eventually strangle itself, and that the good guy's job is mostly to hold on long enough for that to happen rather than to defeat evil through force alone. None of this makes the book a sermon. Tolkien would have hated hearing it called that, but once you see this scaffolding, you can't unsee it. And it's a huge part of why the story has this weight and gravity that pure adventure fiction almost never has. Now let's talk about scale, because this is the part that generally has no precedent before Tolkien in English literature. The Lord of the Rings takes place in what Tolkien called the Third Age of Middle-earth. That phrase alone should tell you something. By the time Frodo leaves the Shire, there are already 2 entire prior ages of history sitting behind him. Thousands of years of it. Most of it which never even makes it into the trilogy directly. Tolkien spent close to 60 years, starting around the time of World War I and continuing until his death in 1973, building out that deeper history in what got published after his death as the Silmarillion. It starts with a creation myth called the Elwynudale. I knew that one before, but not. The music of the Anur, where the world is literally sung into existence by angelic beings under the guidance of the one god, Eru. It's structured almost exactly like Genesis, a divine act of creation through will and music rather than random accident. One of the most angelic beings, Melkor, introduces discord into the music out of pride and a desire to create something of his own apart from Eru, with the god. And that discord becomes the root of all evil in the world going forward. Melkor is, in almost every meaningful way, Tolkien's version of Lucifer, a being who was originally the greatest and most gifted of the angelic powers before his pride corrupted him. From there, you get the First Age, an entire war-torn era involving the Silmarils, 3 jewels containing the captured light of 2 magical trees that lit the world before the sun and moon existed. Melkor, later called Morgoth, steals them, and that theft launches generations of war, betrayal, and tragedy among the elves, including a kingslaying where elves murder other elves for the first time in world's history. Buried in that era is the story of Beren and Luthien, a mortal man and an immortal elf prince who fall in love. Luthien actually gives up her immorality to be with him. Tolkien loved this story so much that he had the names Beren and Luthien engraved on his own gravestone and his wife's beneath their real names. That's not a minor detail. That's a man building a fictional love story so central to his own worldview that he wanted it on his actual tombstone. Then comes the Second Age, which includes the story of Numenor, a great island kingdom of men raised up by the gods as a reward for helping fight Morgoth, who eventually grow proud, envy the elves' immortality, and rebel against the powers that made them, invading the Undying Lands in an attempt to seize immortality by force. Their kingdom is drowned beneath the sea as a result, essentially Tolkien's own version of Atlantis, and also carries a clear echoes of the Tower of Babel and the flood. A civilization destroyed because of the specific sin of pride and the refusal to accept the limits placed on them. It's also during the Second Age that the Rings of Power themselves get forged, and the One Ring specifically by Sauron, who is Morgoth's lieutenant, and takes over as the primary evil power once Morgoth himself is finally defeated and cast out of the world entirely. By the time you reach the Third Age, the era of the actual Lord of the Rings trilogy, you are already standing on top of thousands of years of fallen kingdoms, broken oaths, drowned islands, and dead languages. That's why Aragorn's lineage means something when it's revealed. That's why the ruins scattered through the story, old watchtowers, forgotten roads, abandoned mines, feel like real archaeological instead of set dressing. Tolkien built the layers first and let his characters walk through the sediment of a real, aged world. And all this connects back to the real mythology Tolkien had spent his academic life studying. He drew from Beowulf, from the Norse sagas and the Icelandic Eddas, from the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, which he specifically credited as a major influence on the whole Silmarillion project. He wasn't inventing myth from nothing. He was building something that felt like it belonged next to Norse and Anglo-Saxon mythology, because he understood, better than almost everyone alive at the time, what actually matters. Ancient myth feel ancient. That's why nobody has really replicated Middle-earth's depth since. Most fantasy worlds get built to serve one trilogy. Tolkien built 60 years of history first, and then let one story, the smallest and most human-scaled one he had, play out on top of it. I wanted to pull out a couple more specific pieces of that First Age history because they explain so much of what shows up later. The whole war over the Silmarils kicked off because of Feanor, the greatest craftsman the elves ever produced, the one who actually made the three jewels in the first place. When Morgoth steals them and kills Feanor's father, Feanor swears a terrible oath along with his 7 sons to pursue anyone, friend or enemy, who keeps a Silmaril from them, and that oath ends up dragging his entire family into centuries of kinslaying, betrayal, and tragedy, even against other elves who never did anything to them. It's one of the earliest and clearest statements in the Legendarium of a theme that runs through everything Tolkien wrote. That a vow or an oath taken in pride and anger can become its own kind of curse, binding you to a terrible action long after the original grievance stops mattering. Feanor's brother, Fingolfin, later in that same age rides alone to Morgoth's fortress and challenges him to a single combat, knowing he can't win, purely because he refuses to let despair have the last word. And he actually wounds Morgoth before he's finally killed, which is treated as one of the most heroic acts in the entire history of the world, specifically because it was hopeless, and he did it anyway. Then there's the Last Alliance, which any fan of the films will recognize from the opening of the Fellowship of the Ring. The final joint war between elves and men at the end of the Second Age, where Sauron is defeated for the first time when Isildur cuts the One Ring from his hand. That single moment, Isildur choosing to keep the ring for himself instead of destroying it in the fire, right there when he had the chance, is the mistake that the entire trilogy exists to correct 3,000 years later. The Nazgul, the ring race, who chase the hobbits in the early chapters, were originally 9 kings of men who accepted rings of power from Sauron, and were slowly corrupting into wraiths, neither living nor dead, entirely enslaved to his will. That's thousands of years of consequences sitting behind 9 cloaked figures on horses, chasing 4 hobbits out of the Shire. And Tolkien expects you to feel the weight of that history even in the scenes where it's never fully explained. I want to pause before the quote section and make one more important point, because I think it's the reason this book keeps getting rediscovered by new generations instead of fading the way most 20th century fantasies has. Tolkien wrote a story about power corrupting even good people, about small, unimportant individuals being the ones who actually change history instead of kings or armies, about industrialization and machinery hollowing out something real and natural, and about the difference between leaders who respond to crisis with despair versus leaders who respond with stubborn hope. None of that is dated. If anything, all 4 of those ideas describe modern life better with every passing decade. You don't have to squint very hard to see the ring as a stand-in for any kind of power, political, financial, technological, that corrupts almost everyone who picks it up, regardless of their original intentions. That's why this story keeps getting reread instead of just rewatched for the special effects. Now let's get practical for a minute, because I think this book has lines that are genuinely useful to you right now, not just nostalgic references. And I want to be careful here because a lot of most of the quotes from the Lord of the Rings people know are actually from the Peter Jackson films, not Tolkien's original text. And I'll flag which as we go. From the actual books written by Tolkien himself, not all those who wander are lost. That's a line from a poem about Aragorn, describing a man who looks like a wandering vagabond, but is secretly the rightful king in exile. It's become shorthand for anyone whose path doesn't look conventional or successful from the outside, but is actually purposeful, genuinely useful if you're talking to anyone who feels behind in life by some conventional measure. Also from the books, Gandalf to Frodo. When Frodo says he wishes the ring had never came to him, and none of this happened to him in his lifetime, Gandalf says, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." Unquote. I think that might be the single most useful line in the entire trilogy for actual life. It's a complete answer to feeling overwhelmed by circumstances you didn't choose and can't control. You don't get to pick your era or your circumstances. You only get to decide what to do inside of them. From Sam, a much simpler and more practical line, quote, "It's the job that's never started, as takes the longest to finish," unquote. That's just a plain statement about procrastination, and it holds up very well as any productivity quote you'll find today. There's also a passage from Sam later in the story thinking about the old tales and legends he'd grown up hearing, wondering aloud whether the people in those old stories knew they were living through something that would become a story people told later, and whether they'd had turned back if they'd had the choice. Is Tolkien reflecting through Sam on the fact that the people living through history rarely feel heroic in the moment. They mostly just feel tired and scared and keep going anyway. That's a genuinely honest thought about what courage actually feels like from the inside versus how it looks from the outside afterwards. Now, the ones that get quoted constantly but are actually from the films, not the books, Galadriel's line in the Fellowship movie, "Even the smallest person can change the course of the future," is a Peter Jackson era addition. It's not in Tolkien's prowess, though it's a fair summary of the book book's actual themes about hobbits being the ones who save the world instead of kings or wizards. Similarly, Sam's speech in the film, "There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for," compresses and rewrites a longer, quieter passage from the book, where Sam thinks about how even in the darkest places there is light and the good that the shadow can't touch. The film version is more quotable, but it's Jackson's screenwriters, not Tolkien, who wrote that specific phrasing. I think that distinction actually matters if you're using these quotes seriously rather than just as movie trivia. The book's actual sentences tend to be quieter and more understandable than the film's punchier rewrites. But they hold up under more scrutiny because they were built with 60 years of careful thought behind them, not written to fit inside a 2.5 hour runtime. A few more worth having in your back pocket: Aragorn rallying men who know they're going to likely ride to their deaths, tells them that a day may come when courage fails and friendships end, but it is not this day. A line that's genuinely useful anytime you need to talk to yourself or someone else into showing up for one another on a hard day, even without a guarantee that things are going to end well. Gimli, describing what real loyalty looks like, says that a dwarf or anyone worth their word doesn't abandon a friend just because the road ahead gets dark, which holds up as a plain, practical statement about what loyalty actually costs you when it's real. And then there's a quieter one from Sam near the very end that I think about more than almost any other line in the books. After everything is over and the ring is destroyed and he's home safe with his friends and family, he simply says, "Well, I'm back," which lands with enormous weight after everything that came before it. A reminder that the goal was never glory. It was just getting to come home and live an ordinary life again. That's a very different definition of a happy ending than most adventure stories bother with. So when I say this is peak writing, I don't mean it's just a fun adventure with a satisfying ending, though it is that too. I mean that Tolkien built the languages before the map, the theology before the plot, and 60 years of buried history before he ever let Frodo leave the Shire. Almost nothing else in the genre was built with that much patience or that much underlying seriousness about what stories are actually for. If you've only ever seen the films, I genuinely tell you to go read the books themselves. Slower than you think you need to, because the payoff is exactly the kind of depth we just spent the last great while for walking through. And if you don't have time to read the books, I've read the first two, and then I audiobooked the third one, The Return of the King. It's a good way to go. So what do you think? Does this change how you think about the story, or were you already seeing some of this? Some of the Christian underlying tones, or if you haven't watched this, the movies, maybe watch them and see if you can see these themes yourself. Let me know in the comments, email me, all the above. Stay curious.